Welcome to a fantastic edition of Rebellion's educational series. We're here with two-star General John F. Hussey, one of the brightest military minds I've come across, and I'm so honored to have him on today. Thank you so much, sir.
Thanks, Alex. Thanks for having me. I look forward to a great discussion. And thanks for having me up in the DC area last week for discussion on the future of warfare. I appreciate it.
Well, that was fantastic. And also, thank you for your service to this country, of course.
Thank you.
So the topic of the day is exiting a military conflict. Gaza is going to become invaded by the IDF. Many wonder, does the IDF actually have a plan once they've taken it? The way the U.S. really did not have much of an exit plan for Afghanistan and Iraq, where the exits were quite nationally embarrassing. And then, as I mentioned to you, when it comes to Vietnam, the images of helicopters being tossed into the ocean because our exit was one of the most abysmal exits of all time. And then you look back at Korea, and so I ask you, when was the last time we had a successful exit from a military campaign, and how do you do it?
Well, that could probably be dated by various historians, right? So we look at World War II, and war continues to change, it continues to evolve. But the one thing that happened in World War II was total defeat of the enemy, right? I mean, when you look at what the Allies did to the Nazis, it was total capitulation. When you look at what happened in Japan with the dropping of the two atomic bombs, we basically had total and unconditional surrender. And you don't often see that anymore. I'd say the closest that I've seen, from a U.S. perspective, where we kind of got the mission right, and people would argue this, would be Desert Storm. If you recall, Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait on August 2nd, 1990. Then the first President Bush rallied a coalition of the willing to go ahead and fight against Saddam in the occupation of Kuwait. And he had limited objectives. All right, it was very clear that he basically said that this would not stand, and the coalition's job was to go ahead and drive the Iraqi occupying force out of Kuwait. Now, many people subsequently asked, especially when Saddam came back and was a brutal dictator, why didn't they go further? There were a variety of reasons, and one is that wasn't what the mission was. That's not what the United Nations mandated the coalition forces to do. The second aspect of that is, and we've seen it now since OIF, Operation Iraqi Freedom in 2003, we did not want to take Saddam out because it would have definitely upset many of the Arab countries. And we can see right now with the situation with the IDF, how the Arab street, quote unquote, can react. The other part is we wanted Saddam in there to counter Iranian influence. And if we took out Saddam, it would have created a vacuum where Iran, and we know we're dealing with basically a state that supports terrorism, would have had open entry to go in and conduct nefarious activity in Iraq. And we saw that, during 2003 onward, and we're seeing it to this day, where I was reading what's known as the early bird about Iranian proxies hitting various U.S. targets. So those were the reasons. So people would argue with me and say, well, because we didn't finish the job. To me, the job was done. Limited military objectives to remove Saddam, and I think President Bush lived up to it along with coalition partners and did a good job on that.
That's absolutely a great point. General Stormin Norman Schwarzkopf was a hero of mine growing up, and I don't know your opinion, but I always thought he did a masterful job.
Absolutely. I mean, he was, when you look at his communication skills, when you looked at him and General Powell talking about basically cutting off communications, I thought their briefings were right on. And he articulated his strategy, rallied the coalition together. It was fabulous. It's really what, the Western way. And we kind of discussed that last week at the conference, right? Desert Storm was the Western way of war. It was quick. It was decisive, minimal casualties. Everybody got back kind of, on with their lives in 2 to 4 months, as opposed to the Eastern way of war, which we've seen in Vietnam, Afghanistan, the Chinese way of war, where it'll drag on. It's a fight of attrition. It's a fight of time. And it kind of counterbalances what we want in the West, right? Where we refer to them as the forever wars.
No, forever wars really, they become, tougher, of course, with the political climate of today, where within 2 years of being elected, you're essentially running for re-election, and so the resolve is questionable. What do you think Israel should do, and what do you think they might do in regards to Gaza here?
So this is beyond a military question, right? And let's get into it. So I wrote down some definitions, and I think it's important that I read it, okay, just to get it clear. So what is an end state? Okay, because when you enter a war, Clausewitz would say, and Clausewitz is a Prussian theorist, okay, that basically everybody in the military studies. And he wrote a book on war, and his quotes are used, but they're important quotes, and I want to read them, all right? War is not merely a political act, but a real political instrument, a continuation of political intercourse, a carrying out of the same by other means. So basically, what he's saying, right, is you have your political objectives. And what people try to do, think of, even two kids, in a schoolyard. Hey, that's my baseball. No, that's my baseball. You have a discussion first. And when you don't get what you want, then you may use force. So it's no different than politics, right? You're arguing over something, you're trying to resolve it diplomatically, but when you don't do it, you're using force to compel the enemy to submit to your will. So you're trying to achieve a political goal. And so thus the end state, you kind of got to lay out an end state. And it's not just a military end state because there's a political solution. So the end state is the planned transition to the host nation of all functions on behalf of peace operation forces. So think about that.
Yep.
What Israel really wants is right. I mean, that's the bottom line. And the question is military force going to bring that? And I was just reading, General Petraeus has a great book out right now, and it's new, and I'm just reading it right now. Excuse me, because I have my notes in there. But it's called Conflict. And I'm reading here about Israel's first wars back in 47 up until the morning news today. And basically, it's about land. And neither side has been able to resolve this militarily. And it's a political solution. But they'll continue to use force, right? We saw Jordan, we saw Syria, we saw Egypt, we saw the Yom Kippur War, but nothing has resolved itself through force. This is going to require a political solution, but you have extremists now, particularly in Hamas up in Gaza, right? And Hezbollah up in Lebanon, supported by Iran. And they're going to continue to try this. Now, Israel has to respond. As Netanyahu pointed out, right, what would America have done after Pearl Harbor? What would they have done after 9/11? But there's also what's going on now is an information war. And regardless, a country like Israel, the United States, that follows international rules of law are going to lose this because they're taking civilians, they're showing the catastrophic and collateral damage. And it's upsetting. And some people can't separate Hamas from the Palestinians. Listen, I said this, I teach a class, and I think Hamas should be met at the gates of hell by Lucifer himself. I get that. But I also feel bad for the Palestinian father that's trying to raise 3 kids and take care of his mother in the house. That's the part of it. And Hamas is doing this intentionally to draw Israel in. At the end of the day, I fully believe that Israel just wants to eliminate Hamas, but they don't want to stay in there and govern the Palestinian people. And thus that becomes the problem. The other aspect of this is it's what's known as mission creep. And this is where the United States has continued to fail in Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan. And people don't understand that because war is uncertain, war is complex, and Clausewitz would tell you that. So as the Israelis go in, we don't know what's going to happen. Could a foreign nation come in? We don't know that. Could foreign fighters come in? And things are going to change on the ground where they might not be able to just go in, have a military solution, and then back out because the problem's still not going to be eliminated. So if you look at Afghanistan, for example, our mission was clear. It was basically to, secure the United States against terrorist attack by going after bin Laden, the al-Qaeda network, and the Taliban that supported him. That was it. Some people could say, hey, why didn't we leave after we did that? We scattered them. Yeah, we didn't get Osama bin Laden for some time after. I fully understand that. But initially, we achieved our objectives quickly. Then we took the eye off the ball and went into Iraq in 2003, but we didn't. We stayed there. And this becomes part of the reason why we stay. I use it and I liken it to a party. Consider, you're in a nice neighborhood. You have a barbecue in your backyard, right? And picture this. I'm talking about young 20-year-olds. You have the hot dogs left out. You leave the beer out, the keg beer, the soda, and you don't clean it up. what's going to happen? You're going to get bugs, you're going to get rats. It's going to reduce the quality of life, right? It almost goes back to the criminal justice theory of broken windows. It's going to drive it down. And that's exactly what happens. If you go in a military operation, kind of like what Russia did with Afghanistan, and you pull out and leave a vacuum there with a dysfunctioning government, it becomes a failed state. And that's where nefarious actors come in. And that's why Al Qaeda was allowed to set up and then threaten the world. So that's why, it's very easy to go into one of these areas, right? And people, the pundits, hey, we've got to go attack, we've got to go attack. But, it's not. And as General Powell noted in what's called the Pottery Barn rule, and he mentioned this to President Bush, hey, if you go in, you own it. And think about what he means. So let's look at the Israelis today. If they go in and they take, right now there's been talk about them controlling the water, the electricity, the internet, telephone. They, in essence, become the government. Now the people need food. Old ladies in hospitals, right? People, like, we have some form of social security in this country, education, transportation, bus, garbage. You own it all. And this is going to become the responsibility of the Israeli government to go ahead and monitor and govern for 2.4 million people. And that's exactly what Colin Powell told President Bush. If you go into Iraq, you own veterans care, the military, police, security, rule of law, courts, buses, trains, education, hospitals. And that's the burden of it. And you can't just pull out, because if you do, you go back into that failed state analogy I gave with the backyard barbecue. And you can't have that, because now you've made an area unstable, and you've made the surrounding nations unstable, and you've put yourself in jeopardy as well.
That's absolutely a great point. You break it, you bought it, and that's what happened with America. So, was there a solution in your mind to pulling out of Afghanistan where it could have been done in an efficient and successful manner?
Well, I remember when 9/11 happened, right? And I got a PowerPoint brief, and it explained basically where we're going. And military advisors, and that's what the military does, because remember, the military works for civilian owners, all right? We work for elected officials. And look how many different presidents we had. We had President Bush, President Obama, right? President Trump, and Biden. And when we spoke last week at the Future Warfare, look at some of the nemesis that we're dealing with right now. We have China, we have Russia, we have North Korea, we have Iran. These leaders have been in charge for decades. So they can have a vision, they can stay with that vision, but very frequently in democracy, that continues to change. And as the elected officials leave and they're elected based on the will of the people, their vision changes. And what we've seen in the United States, because of political discourse, is one administration comes in and whatever they did, just say they went right. The new administration, and I don't mean right, left from political points of view, just, I gave the direction right. The new administration come in and say, we're going to go left. And when you do that, you confuse basically the people in your own nation. You're confusing your allies. You haven't budgeted for it. See, China right now is in a long-term vision of some 50 years. So they can plan. Everybody knows where they're going. They're budgeting for it. They've had the same leader. Now, I'm not to suggest, we put a dictator in. That's not what I'm saying. But because we're a Western democracy, it becomes more difficult to have a long-term vision, that people don't change, that budgets don't change for it, right? And as Clemenceau said, right, back in France, war is too important to be left to the generals. So while all this is going on, your elected officials have to think of a variety of other things, from COVID to education to the migration problems down at the southern border, to civil rights. I mean, that's one of the problems that Lyndon Baines Johnson had, and it's depicted in the movie Selma, where Martin Luther King was trying to push for civil rights for the African Americans, and Johnson was trying to push more, President Johnson, because he had the war in Vietnam. Well, Martin Luther King was saying no. So the point is, on a politician's desk is much more simply than war, which is basically the focal point of what a general has. So it becomes much more complex than an authoritarian nation. When you go into these situations, we like to say a whole of government approach. And we give that, I think, a lot more lip service. So we have instruments of national power. So does every nation. And we use acronyms to do that. And I'll explain that to your audience. It's called DIMEFIL, all right? DIMEFIL, dime, diplomacy. So if we have a situation, right, whatever the case may be, for example, right after 9/11, President Bush tried to negotiate with the Taliban, said turn over Osama bin Laden and rid yourself of Al Qaeda. That was a measure of diplomacy. Didn't happen. You have information operations, and that's basically what we're seeing right now going on in the Middle East, right? Hamas is doing an excellent job of showing the Palestinian suffering. Israel's trying to counter that with the hostages. So we have a bit of an information war going on to tug at the hearts of that audience, the wide audience out there. M stands for military, and we all know what military force is, and E is for economics. I've read various articles where you look at Cuba, Iran, do economic sanctions work, do they not? But the problem is if you come up with an immediate crisis and try to impose economic sanctions, they're long lasting. They could take 5, 10 years, even more. So it's not going to have an immediate effect. And then after 9/11, we saw FIL, F-I-L. So that's finance, right? A lot of these terrorists, you got to follow the money. You look at the money trail, where it's coming from the Middle East to Europe and back to the United States. And so you're looking at that. Intelligence, extremely important, and we should be sharing intelligence with those nations with like minds, and we do. And there's a criminal nexus to this too, as we go into what's called irregular warfare. So there could be drug cartels, human trafficking. So it's important that intelligence be shared. And then, as I noted last time, there's the L, and we just mentioned that, law enforcement. So it could mean, New York City police cooperating with Interpol in Europe about suspects involved in narcotics, weapons trafficking, and human trafficking, where we go ahead, share that intelligence, and try to work collectively to stop the threats internationally. So that's the whole of government approach. And as I mentioned the other day, I like to use the analogy of, I think we've all been there and seen, where mom might be cooking a Thanksgiving dinner, and on the stove, you have various pots, and some pots are boiling up, and then maybe the biscuits are heating up. And it's just a metaphor, if you will. But what that's showing, right, is kind of the world is. We have so many trouble spots, right, going on now. And so when mom has those issues, the first thing she tries to do is reduce the gas or take the pots off the stove.
But if the only really way to be successful in a military conflict is to have absolute surrender, how do you have absolute surrender when you're just trying to deal with so many pots that you can't put your pure focus on one versus the other? Clausewitz, said that the only way to win war is through absolute methods. And can we
Okay, so let's go back. So two different questions there. The pots that I'm talking about is the various things boiling up right now that haven't hit the point of conflict. That's where diplomacy has to come in, and the international community has to look to lower the gas, right? Get those hot pots off the stove, because the last thing you do is turn up the gas, and when you introduce the military into that, you do that. And anyway, that's a metaphor. So what I'm advocating, in many pundits, to include former Secretary of Defense Robert Gates, said we spend so much more money in the United States on the military than the State Department. And again, all these situations resort around a political solution. But and internationally, not just here, the Middle East, and any problems in the Ukraine war, right? This is about land and Putin expanding and trying to bring back the Russian Empire. But he's using military force to do so. So yes. So when you look at this militarily, right, that becomes the conundrum. Do you just send in, for example, you mentioned Operation Iraqi Freedom. I mean, that military plan was absolutely brilliant. We went in, didn't have a lot of casualties. We hit Baghdad quick. We knocked out Saddam's forces. But what's known as phase 4 and 5, where you transition to civil authority, right, and you set up a government, we absolutely failed in it, because that really is more of a State Department role than a military role, although the military plans fit with some of their civil affairs personnel and also the State Department. But it's not something they're trained for. It's not something they're used to. They're used to going in, closing with the enemy, destroying the enemy, and that becomes the issue. So again, should we have pulled out right after that? And again, we would have left such a vacuum that Iraq definitely would have become a failed state. Iranian influence would have went in there, and the situation in the Middle East now could be much worse than it is. And that's why we stayed for almost a decade in Iraq. Less than a decade, but thereabout.
Do you think there was a possibility for Condoleezza Rice to successfully set up a government, or do you think, she was kind of playing an impossible game?
Well, it was difficult, and a lot of the times people don't understand, because you have histories of culture, right? Centuries there. and there was such a rift between the Sunni and Shia that it's a religious rift that a lot in the West don't understand. But Saddam basically was in the minority, had less than 33% of Sunni, a lot of Shia influence there, some 60 some odd percent, and then we had Kurds as well. And that was another problem. But Iranian influence in there was creating problems. So when we got in there, it's similar to what we did in World War II, where we denazified it, we de-Baathized it. And that created problems because you put hundreds of thousands of police and security forces now onto the street, which created animosity for them. They had no way to feed their family, so they quickly became the insurgents. So if you look back at that, that was one of the cardinal mistakes we made by doing that. These guys were unemployed and resentful, and they became part of the insurgency. So again, one of the things I don't think we in the West do a good job is of reading history. Reading our doctrine, understanding the history, what were the mistakes we made in the past, how can we rectify them in the future? And although things change, some stay the same. Now, you said too, which was an interesting point, can we go ahead and have absolute victory today? And it's difficult, and I'm going to tell you why. I like many of my peers have had the discussion, could we have done 1944 June 6 D-Day today? I don't know if we could have with the media. I don't know if the West, the American population, could have seen the carnage on those beaches and then not called for a halt, similar to what we're seeing now in Gaza, right, with the strikes. So it's difficult for a modern military to go in and annihilate any group without international pressure. And this happened with the Marines in Fallujah as well. When they were surrounding Fallujah, they were ready to go in, and Arab nations came in and put a lot of pressure on the United States. And then President Bush basically stood the Marines down. And that has to do with the media, social media, and the information operations that we spoke about previously. It's difficult to have the total victory that I discussed before. Where centuries ago, we didn't have social media. No. We didn't have, CNN correspondents and Fox correspondents on the news looking at the death and destruction. Go ahead.
Can you imagine the CNN coverage of Sherman's march to the sea?
No. War is hard, right? And it's not easy. And so now with this media, and listen, anybody would tell you, right, at my level, part of what you're going to do is be prepared that, you're going to have that microphone stuck under your throat, and it's going to be complex, and you have to give good answers, right? And a typical military answer is, I'm not sure what's going on now. The case is under review. And meanwhile, the enemy is showing those pictures of young people being killed, right? The horrors of war, the acts of war. And it's difficult for my generation because I didn't grow up with social media, and I can't understand why 19-year-old Americans, or anybody else for that matter, are so interested to take pictures of what they do and post them to social media, especially when they're conducting themselves in inappropriate ways. They're losing. And we call that in the military, and I'm not sure if you or your audience have heard it, the strategic corporal. Have you heard that term, Alex?
No, I have not.
Okay, so let's look at Abu Ghraib. These were a bunch of young American individuals acting.
Viewers, the general took over Abu Ghraib, the famous Abu Ghraib prison, and cleaned it up.
Yes, after the scandal, and I had a great amount of help with staff and senior leaders as well to help in that mission. But the point I'm making is these individuals conducted themselves inappropriately. They took pictures. Those pictures were exposed to the international community, and we lost our strategic standing. Okay, I mean, internationally, we were supposed to be an ethical army, and we lost that. I've shown pictures before of U.S. troops in Afghanistan urinating on dead Taliban fighters, right? Again, why are you taking those pictures? They're exposed, and we lose our standing. So you look at the George Floyd incident in Minneapolis a couple of years ago with the police officer, Derek Chauvin. He became a strategic corporal for the police department that internationally, right, people were starting to question police officers around the globe. So what I'm trying to say, the strategic corporal is a young individual that can go out and has significant responses based on their actions, and they can change international feelings. So if we went back in history, for example, the My Lai massacre, if that had been exposed due to social media and media coverage, I mean, obviously it was exposed, but in today's world, I mean, forget it. The United States would have been in a precarious situation that I don't know if they could have overcome at that time. And so we have to train our people, and that's why today only about 25% of the youth can join, and we vet them, and we want to make sure they're good, because some of these individuals are going to be 25 and 26-year-old individuals out on their own, not with an officer in charge, not like a platoon or company size element that America may think, but they could be MPs, 4, 8 MPs out on their own without leadership around for 50, 100 miles, and they've got to act accordingly, or they can hurt the United States and what they're trying to achieve strategically.
That's a great point. That's really a great point. So, Israel seems to have almost an impossible position in front of them to take this, to hold this, to make it safe again. You know, I wish them luck. And General, thank you so much for coming on today. This was like such a phenomenal conversation. I couldn't be more thankful. I go back to Sherman because I think he was the most effective Northern general, and as a Civil War obsessed individual, my four greats grandfather was shot in the belly at Gettysburg. I feel Civil War teaches us a lot, and where you had to win, complete surrender, and absolute war was necessary. And at the same time, Sherman's work could never have been accomplished in today's 2023, which means that the general who was the best for us in the United States could not have done what he did. So we're in a very different world. War is changing in a very, scary and interesting way. And, I guess we'll see how it goes. Thank you so much again, General. Do you have any parting thoughts you'd like to share with us before we sign off?
Yeah, Alex, I just appreciate what you're doing, as a civilian, trying to reach out to a larger civilian audience and explain what's going on. It's important. So thanks for having me, and anything I can do in the future to help you and your organization, please let me know.
No, my pleasure. We did a poll where 6 out of 10 of our viewers actually had a master's degree or higher. So, Rebellion really tries to cater to a more educated audience that, cares about making a difference in this world. So anyway, sir, thank you again for your service, and it was an honor to spend this time with you.
Thank you. You enjoy your day.
Bye.